Well, this evening I've come down to the English Riviera, commonly known as Torquay or even Torbaydos. As you can see behind me, I'm on the old Princess Pier, which kind of goes right through here. It's like an old pier, some lovely sort of oak planks on the floor, and this sort of wrought iron, white painted wrought iron work along the side with these lanterns in the background. I'm using the 5.4 system tonight. I've got a very simple sort of composition set up, but the camera's kind of tilted to the side to kind of get a nice sort of like a lead-in line with the seats going through to like a vanishing point in the distance. I'm using Fuji Velvia tonight, so nice sort of rich colours. The sun's off, well, to the left or to the right of the camera basically, so I'll probably use a polarizer. And that's all I need. Got some nice puffy clouds in the skies, which is good. So yeah, I'm all set up here. I've got my composition lined up, so I'll show you the movement on the camera and just give you a quick spin around to sort of show you the composition that I've got here. My camera's it's facing downwards, but because I'm quite a way off the first post in the seats here, the focus is fine. So like I say, I'm going to stop down to about f22. That should give me enough focus right through then. Now, excuse the wind noise if there is any. It's pretty windy up on here. So I've set my aperture now to f22. I was getting full focus around f11, so but f22 will give me that little bit more, especially down the furthest end of the pier or the seating that I'm photographing here. So basically, same principle. Get everything set up. My composition's done. Everything's in focus. So now, obviously, shut down the lens, cock the shutter, and I'm ready to go. I always do a little test. Just to make sure that the shutter's working before I start loading any film up, and then double check and triple check that the lens iris is closed down or the shutter's closed down. So everything's in place, so I'm ready to load the film up and away we go. And again, metering wise, I'm using my DSLR. I've set it at f22, which is my exposure that's on the large format camera. I've got it down to ISO 100, and then obviously whatever base reading I get, I'll have to add an extra stop. I also need to add some more exposure because I'm using a polarizing filter as well, so I normally add another stop with Velvia, and that's normally fine. So I'm just going to take my reading. I'm probably going to take it off the timber. It's a nice sort of neutral grey colour, so it's an ideal starting point for a base exposure. So my base exposure at f22. This is at ISO 100, is 1/8 of a second. So if I add on another stop for that, which brings it down to ISO 50, which is the same as the film, that brings me to 1/4 of a second, and then another stop for the polarizer will give me 1/2 a second. Now I know from years ago using Velvia all the time, in these conditions with the sun position where it is, this kind of subject with a blue sky, you're always looking at around sort of a 1/2 a second or 1 second as a start point. I will sort of bracket around that, but I'm going to start with the 1/2 second exposure. I might go the other way and sort of underexpose a little bit. Right, okay, filter's in place, film's loaded up, ready to go. There's quite a lot of people walking up and down, but at the moment it's fairly quiet, but the sun's gone behind a cloud for a minute, typical. So I'm just going to wait for a little bit longer before I actually expose the film. Right, in terms of filtration, I've got a polarizer on the front, which I've allowed a little bit more exposure for, normally about 1 stop, 1.5 stops, that's normally fine, especially on Velvia. I'm also using a 2-stop soft grad, and I'm bringing that right down across the sky. It's quite bright, and I've also got underneath the benches here, it's quite dark, so you've got that kind of difference in exposure, so that will help a bit. And obviously being a soft grad, it doesn't cut, you don't see that sort of graduation line, or that's the plan, that's what I'm hoping. So that's all in place, everything's ready to go. So I always do a quick test before, just to make sure that the shutter's working fine, and obviously last check is to make sure it's closed up before I take the dark slide out and expose the film. Okay, my last exposure. Taking 3 exposures now, this is the 3rd one. Now before I do anything else, I've just taken 1 frame there, so before I take the film out and put it in my bag, I need to mark, because I've still got a sheet left in one side of the film holder, so I need to mark which sheet that I've used, so I know when I use it again in a bit, I'll know which sheet to use next. So now I've shot here, I'm going to wait for the sun to drop a little bit more, and I'm going to go over that side. I don't know if you can see in the distance there, just below those buildings, there's a modern structure, a modern bridge that goes over the harbour. I shot it years ago digitally, but I'm going to have a go tonight with film. But I'm going to wait for the blue hour before I start shooting, and I've got 3 frames left, so. Exposure's got to be critical, but I'm probably looking at around a 30-second, maybe a 1-minute exposure. But we'll get down there in a bit, get set up, and we can see what I can get. Okay, well we're here. Come down over to the newer bridge that goes across the harbour. You can see these 2 long things sticking up here. It looks pretty sort of unremarkable at the moment in daylight, but once the lights come on, all these sort of structures here are all sort of lit up, and all the railings that you can see going along there, they've got lights in the railings. There's also sort of floodlights underneath that floodlight the railings. I've got the 5.4 set up here. I've got another portrait format shot lined up. I've got 3 sheets of Velvia left, Velvia 50. I've got I've got a 150mm lens, so I've kind of stood back a bit to try and get these two towers in. I've had to put a bit of rise on the lens, quite a bit of rise actually, to sort of get them in without me sort of standing on a step ladder. I can't get them in otherwise, so that's where large format comes in really handy, because you can sort of raise the lens up without having to raise the whole camera up. So yeah, I'm all set up. Just waiting for the light to drop now, waiting for blue hour. Excuse the noise in the background, kids, people everywhere, so it's chaos. Focusing's pretty critical here on this shot, because of those tower structures that are sticking up quite far. One, I've had to use quite a few movements to get those towers in, and 2, obviously with the movements I've had to use a smaller aperture as well to get the depth of field that I want. I'm using f32 which is giving me focus from the bottom of the railings here in the foreground to the tips of those towers, and obviously all the background buildings as well. You can see from the front of the camera I've got quite a lot of rise. I've got a little bit of forward tilt as well, just a tiny bit, a little fraction of that, just to get the railings in the foreground in focus. No shift or anything, that's pretty much all the movements, but because of that rise and that tilt, obviously I'm going to have to use a smaller aperture to get my focus. And when I'm focusing on the ground glass screen, I've got my dark cloth over and I use a loop. This is a pretty good loop, it's a Kaiser loop. Basically put it on the screen and sort of check all around the image for focus. As I'm looking through, I'm altering the aperture, so I'm closing the aperture down, and it's almost like a depth of field preview. I've mentioned this in previous videos before. So as you close the lens down, do it gradually, and your eyes get used to the darkness, obviously because the lens iris is closing down, and you can kind of see then the depth of field that you need and the aperture you need to choose. Okay, the lights have come on. You can see behind me there, got little blue strip lights going up and down the towers, and also down at the bottom, which is just down there, right along the rails. You can see these white lights, blue lights, that kind of underlight the railings, and also along the edge of the railings you've got white lights as well. So I'm all set up and ready to load up the film. Now, time-wise, it's about 20 minutes after sunset, so I normally like to wait about half an hour to 40 minutes after sunset to get that kind of mix of nice sort of deep blue light in the sky, and obviously the lights of the main subject as well. I've just done a 1 minute exposure and now I'm on a 2 minute exposure, but it's probably going to be around 2 or 3 minutes, maybe even 4 minutes to get this to get the light. You can see the lights are on fully now. The sky is nice and blue. All the lights are coming on. Every now and then people are walking across, but because it's such a long exposure, they'll just kind of flow through and you won't sort of see them. So yeah, at the moment I've got my stopwatch on my phone going, so I've obviously got the camera and the lens on the large format set on the bulb exposure. So I've opened it up with my cable release. As soon as the exposure's finished, I can lock that off then. Okay, my last 4 minute exposure's going on now. Got my stopwatch running again. It's quieting down a bit now, which is typical. So I'm just going to shoot this last frame. This is my last frame of Velvia here, so I'll be wrapping up and going home. The light's starting to drop now. Probably got another 20 minutes or so of light. So hopefully, fingers crossed, these come out. Thanks for joining me on the Riviera, the English Riviera. I hope you've enjoyed watching this one. It's getting a bit dark now, so I'm going to shoot off home. But I say please join me on the next one, and thanks for all your likes and comments, and I'll see you soon.